And we're live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another EUDR Winter School webinar. Good to have you here today with us again. For those that have been with us last week, it'll be a nice session that follows up on that. For those that haven't joined, we can send you the recording afterwards. Feel free to reach out to us. But for now, a very warm welcome. For those that don't know me, I'm Jasper. I'm one of the sustainability researchers at CoolSet. And together with Freddie, who's sitting next to me, we have been working on EUDR for quite a while as part of the research team, basically leading that project. And we've gained a lot of insights over the past couple of months and are sharing these now with this winter school. So we hope that you find some of the insights that we're sharing today useful. Of course, once again, for those insights that haven't been shared, but you still want to have some clarity on, feel free to use the question box in the bottom right. And we'll make sure that we get to most of them during the Q&A at the end. For those that we cannot answer during the Q&A, we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible over email. And you also have the chat function for any kind of issues that maybe happen in the technical realm, or if there's just a comment you'd like to make. We often also have people that leave comments or in the chat function when they have something useful to share. So, for example, we mentioned something about legislative updates or something that that might be useful to add some context. Feel free to provide that as well in the chat function. We're always very happy with people that jump in, share their knowledge as well. I think without further ado, we can get started with today's session. Today we're going to be talking about engaging suppliers and collecting data, how to request geolocation and legality data. I think it's going to be a very, very practical session. So as we know, the deadline is looming and it's now time to really get started. So we're going to kind of give you that very practical overview on how to get there. Quick overview of the plan for today. So we're going to start with an update from Brussels. For those that have been following the updates, you'll know that there's something happening once again. I think that for now, it's more about the updates than the content of the legislation themselves, which is a bit unfortunate, of course, but good to keep you updated there. So we'll start there. Then we're going to give you a recap on Canal Chocolate BV, which is the company that we've created for this winter school, to give you a very practical rundown. We'll talk about requesting data, engaging suppliers, and geolocation requirements, and we'll do that very practically. So how do you do it? How do you not do it? And what are some examples from Canal Chocolate? How would they approach it? Of course, we'll go then into kind of a very brief overview of 5 steps to success, and then end with the Q&A, and hopefully you have enough time there to answer most of your questions in today's session. So for the goal for today is to have you leave the session knowing what data is required for EUDR due diligence, learn how to practically approach suppliers, and understand how to handle unresponsive suppliers, which is, I think, one of the bigger issues within EUDR traceability. So you can do everything right, but at some point you do need to go upstream in your supply chain. And if you have unresponsive suppliers, that is a big issue that you can run into. Last point we want to give you today is that to give you a good understanding of geolocation requirements and formats. Quick update from Brussels. So for those that have followed, you might already know this, but last week on November 13th, the European Parliament voted to fast track the EUDR, which means that it will now be part of the next plenary agenda, which is already taking place next week. So last week there was a vote, but it wasn't on any content. For now, it's just a fast track of the existing Commission proposal, which we probably all know by now, which introduces several amendments, such as no DDS requirements for small European producers, a rebalanced due diligence, for example, for downstream operators, which we'll also discuss. But that means that they, for example, don't have to do a maturity assessment anymore if they request a DDS from the upstream producers within the EU, operators. And then we also have a phased implementation. So that means that for bigger companies that have to comply by the end of this year, there's a 6-month grace period. And for smaller companies, they can start complying by the end of 2026. Last bullet on this slide, I think, kind of encapsulates really well the general spirit of the EUDR, but also a lot of the other sustainability regulations we've seen coming from Brussels recently. There is a lot of uncertainty. So we're covering this closely. We're also going to be keeping an eye out on Brussels next week when this goes to plenary. But for now, unfortunately, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. Important dates to keep mind of. So last week we had the parliamentary vote on the fast track on the 13th of November. Next week it's going to be interesting because on the 24th, 25th, 26th, and 27th, they're going to be discussing various proposals, amendments, legislative drafts in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And that will also include the EUDR. So there we're going to hear more about the content and possible adaptations, possible requests from both kind of left-wing, center, and right-wing blocs. Then on the 15th to the 18th of December, the Parliament moves to adopt the first reading, by which time we'll hopefully have a good idea of where the legislation will stand by the end of the year. And then, if all goes well, by the end of the year, it will be published in the official journal, which is kind of a formal step to announce that the legislation has been made final. So let's get into the details of today's session and give you a bit of a recap of Canal Chocolate BV, which is our company for the winter school. So Canal Chocolate BV, and for those that aren't Dutch, BV is a shortcut for a Dutch type of company. So don't read too much into it. But Canal Chocolate has derivative manufacturers in the Netherlands and is a non-SME. And for this case, we have 3 suppliers that we're going to be focusing on. The company sources from Germany, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Africa. And as we mentioned last week, the scope of the in-scope companies, products essentially rely on the relevant HS codes. So the relevant HS codes for Canal Chocolate are HS code 818061. Don't have to remember the number, but what that means is chocolate and other food preparations containing cacao in blocks, slabs, or bars filled and weighing 2 kilograms or less. But it also purchases HS codes 180100, which are cacao beans whole or broken, raw or roasted, and 180400 cacao butter. So you'll find these HS codes in the annex of the EUDR legislation, where you can then see all of the HS codes, kind of do a cross-reference to see if these HS codes overlap with the products that you're selling. Many ERP systems also have HS codes already linked to the existing products, so that should make it even easier for you to determine whether your products are in scope. Canal Chocolate's responsibilities per supplier are quite straightforward. So on the one hand, Canal Chocolate is a primary operator, which means that it puts products on the EU market because it imports products from non-EU countries to the EU. And that means it needs to have a DDS at customs clearance and needs to collect supply chain and origin data, which is, of course, the topic for today. It also needs to assess risks for the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Africa for African suppliers, which is what we'll be talking about next week in the next winter school session. And of course, it needs to pass on due diligence statements to customers. So it also has a downstream operator role because it also buys from a German manufacturer, and their Canal Chocolate buys products from within the EU and needs to collect DDS references from supplier 3, in this case, the German supplier. In this case, the main responsibility is to record traceability information and to keep that for 5 years for any audits that might come. Here we have a bit of an asterisk because this category of the new downstream operator category is subject to approval under the new Commission proposal. So that is something that we'll know more in the weeks following that. Also, just to give you a brief overview again of the total supply chain of Canal Chocolate. So we know, for example, that they have here several plots in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have a plot here in South Africa. And then they have the various aggregators that kind of bundle those the products. And they have then the suppliers that ultimately bring it to Europe. So how do they kind of go to that supply chain? How do they get to the plots? What information do they need from where? Those are all things we'll hopefully answer today. Before we get into it, I have a question that I want to ask because I'm really curious about this. Let's see. Let me put this poll live and then I'll quickly read it out. What is your biggest barrier in engaging suppliers for EUDR? There's 6 options here, 2 of which are not started and not reporting. So if those are relevant to you, feel free to go ahead. But I'm really curious for those that have started reporting, if there are kind of some clear candidates that you mentioned, those are going to be issues. Also, feel free that if you haven't explicitly started this process, but have already kind of put out some context on what you need, feel free to also vote on that. Let me see. So right now, 33% of you are saying that the biggest issue is that suppliers are not responding or are delaying. 31% are saying that there's a lack of clear data from upstream suppliers. 19% say low suppliers understanding of EUDR. with then a few of you saying not started or not reporting. So that's interesting. It is also kind of what we're seeing. So hopefully this session will give you a bit more guidance on how to address those issues with suppliers and give you the clarity that you need. So let's get into the practicalities of today. So the supplier engagement timeline as we know it today. So assuming that the amendments in the European Parliament next week go through as they currently stand, you need to start engaging suppliers as of now, just because if you're not an SME, you need to comply by the end of this year. That also means that by November, December, you need to be collecting data relevant to your products and your purchase orders and your sales orders, for example. And then by the end of this year, so the 30th of December, you need to have a regulation implementation date ready. That then applies from the 30th of June regarding penalties, because that's when the grace period ends. I do think, if I can already give a bit of a prediction on what will happen in Brussels next week, Strasbourg, that there might be some amendments here, just because I've also read that this grace period isn't really enforceable, because it's quite hard to do from a legislative perspective. So we might see some adjustments there. I've also read some other things that I think are too early to really kind of comment on, just because there's a lot of things going around. There's a lot of different opinions being shared. So for now, let's hold off on that and see how it turns out next week. So what data do you need? There's quite a bit of things that you need from your suppliers, which we'll dive into today. So first of all, you need shipment data, which include sales orders, purchase orders, invoices, products, bills of materials, and suppliers. This is data that you should have already readily available. It might be data that you need to kind of streamline and organize in relation to EUDR, but it should be data that you have. Same for supply chain data. So regarding transport countries and steps, this might be somewhat more complicated if you don't have an existing ERP system, for example, but this should also be something that's not very hard to get an overview of. And then for origin data, it gets a bit more complicated, because, for example, for plots, legality proof, and species, you might have to go to the producer itself, especially for plots and legality proof, because you don't know probably which plots exactly demarcate the plot where you get your products from, because you need to provide exact geolocation data there. For due diligence data, you need to have traceability, DDS references, and evidence bundles if the auditor ever knocks on your door. And then also you need all of this for compliance with Article 9, which is information requirements, and Article 10, which is the risk assessment. So what data do you need from who? So we have here now an overview of the 3 suppliers for our company. Let's see who starts with the DDS. So we know that supplier 1 and supplier 2 are not EU companies, and therefore never have to create their own DDS. It's as black and white as that. We have quite a lot of customers or people that ask us, well, we're based in the UK, for example, or we're based in a non-EU country that has a lot of work in EU countries. Do we need to create a DDS, and where do we do that? The short answer is no, you cannot do that, just because you don't have, for example, a European tax number that you can use to log into traces. So what data do you need? We see here that, for example, for geolocation, deforestation, legality, and traceability, these are all things that you need to ask your non-EU suppliers. And then also for your European supplier, you need to ask this, but they should already have that information, because they need to provide a DDS, and they already had to ask that from their upstream suppliers. Essentially, what this means here is that on paper, your responsibilities as an operator in the European Union are quite limited, because most work sits upstream. You need to ask your suppliers, and in an ideal world, they'll just give you all the information you need. In a realistic world, that is not going to be as straightforward, as, for example, a lot of you have mentioned that getting the right data from suppliers or getting them to respond in the first place is not as easy as it sounds. So this is essentially where the responsibility sits. Then where in the supply chain is that data? So once again, the DDS isn't with the non-EU suppliers, but with the EU suppliers itself. And then for the geolocation, you'll have to go through the producer. So you go to your supplier goes to either their supplier or straight to the producer. And that's the same for deforestation and legality. So they pass it on. And then for traceability, it's the responsibility of the relevant supplier to make sure that they follow the right traces and also pass on that information to you regarding, for example, how the information passes through the system. Good to note here is that you can also directly go to your producer if you have that information, or you can self-declare on behalf of your supplier if you don't know that they're going to be responsive. So that is something that we also discussed last week in the first winter school session, but important to note as well that you can self-declare on their behalf. Bit of a summary before we move on. So from each supplier, you need to identify what you need, as this will vary depending on their position in the supply chain. You need to also get clear on what they can provide you and what will be required from further upstream. And last but not least, you need to ask for specific data to be requested from upstream suppliers. So this is also something that Freddie will cover, but it's really important to be very specific about what you need, because if you just say, hey, we need to send us what we need, you'll probably recognize from your own kind of starting point from EUDR, it's not always as simple. So be really specific, provide a lot of context, and go from there. But that is something that we'll also provide some more context on. And now we'll go on to Freddie, who will break down the supplier engagement.
Thanks, Jasper. Great. I'm going to run you through first a few steps on how to engage your suppliers. So what are these first steps you should be taking to start building these relationships and talk about EUDR with your suppliers? We'll have a little checklist, so about getting started, then the kind of templates and emails you want to send them, how to explain to your suppliers the need for EUDR compliance, and finally unpacking the regulation for those unfamiliar with the EUDR. So to get started, the first step is identifying your key contact person at each supplier. So having one person you're going to go to about EUDR and compliance, and who you'll channel most of your communications with. Because if you're scattering, asking for different pieces of information from different contact people, it can get very confusing both for you and for them. So having a key contact person is really important here. And then begin by scheduling short introduction calls. So explaining your responsibilities, their responsibilities, and filling in any knowledge gaps they might have about the EUDR, communicating that they must support you on your data collection journey if they want to sell within the EU, and sharing timelines and responsibilities early. So avoiding them becoming the blocker and ensuring you've done your part to talk with them. So Canal Chocolate, for example, they begin by mapping all of their suppliers, flagging the ones they believe might need the most support, and assigning a single internal contact. Then they send off a short kick-out email and tell what data will be requested. So yeah, mapping the suppliers here is important as well. So understanding what you want to request from each of your suppliers, as Jasper mentioned earlier, what you need from EU suppliers is different from what you need from your suppliers who are outside the EU. So understanding that and then communicating this at the beginning. Next step is determining some clear modes of communication. So how you're going to go through this process and making sure it's standardized for all of your suppliers. So what can be really helpful here is sending a clear, standardized data request via email with exact fields and deadlines, and having this template which you can use again for multiple suppliers, adapting as necessary. And then following this with a WhatsApp or a WeChat message for quick clarifications and nudges. So those kind of ad hoc questions that suppliers might have. Hosting calls can be really helpful here, introducing the EUDR to your suppliers, running them through a call, so you can be there on demand to answer any questions, and highlighting these data collection techniques, which we'll go through a bit later. And in these kind of communication exchanges, sharing examples of GPS formats, permits, so suppliers know exactly what good looks like. And finally, what we've seen to be really useful for those who are not using a software tool is maybe providing a link where suppliers can upload all evidence they're going to send you. So for example, a Google or OneDrive link to an EUDR portal. So every time they have geolocation data or a document to send you, rather than it getting lost in email chains, you send them this one link and they kind of upload everything to that one unified spot. So Canal Chocolate, our company, for example, began by sending a standardized request pack to all of their suppliers with the relevant template, checklist, and sample files, plus this aforementioned link, so the data could be standardized. Next, what we've seen with people we've spoken to is explaining the need for EUDR compliance can be very confusing, sometimes to suppliers outside the EU. Maybe they understand the EUDR to be kind of a certification or an optional certification that people want to have rather than understanding it as a legal requirement. So what we've seen to be really useful here is just emphasizing this mandatory legality of EUDR and highlighting that if they don't comply or they can't give you the information you need to sell goods within the EU, then you won't be able to do business with them because, it's a mandatory requirement for doing business with companies inside the EU. Another kind of misunderstood conception is that by requesting origin data and geolocation data, some people, suppliers, might see that as a threat to kind of their competitiveness or their sensitive information. But again, making this really clear and say you're only using it for EUDR purposes, it'll be in a kind of external EU managed system, is again kind of reassuring to those suppliers and helps them engage in this process. So what Canal Chocolate did was clearly stating both in that introductory email, but also over the phone, that any missing data risks block shipments, and that, in order to continue their work with these suppliers, they need relevant geolocation and legality data. And finally, unpacking the legislation. I'm sure many of you who are on this webinar know that EUDR is not the most simple legislation, and for those outside the EU who haven't been spending many hours, like I'm sure many of us have, delving into it, it can be quite confusing. So again, here, offering very clear, kind of simple resources is key to help your suppliers along this journey. On the Coolset Academy, we have lots of kind of what is the EUDR and step-by-step articles, which can be helpful to send on. Also, if you're able to, on-the-ground training or virtual sessions are really useful here. We've seen kind of some people we've spoken to have been back to the countries where their goods are produced in, and they've conducted on-the-ground training sessions with their farmers and producers, which sets them up for kind of long-term success. By kind of training early means you have that consistent data and relationship building from the beginning. So what Canal Chocolate did, they weren't able to kind of go on the ground, but they ran a 15-minute screen share call showing kind of start to finish a sample plot file, the legality document, and the flow of data collection, giving the suppliers a concrete picture of what's required without overwhelming them with legislative words and amendments and Brussels changes. Great. Okay, so that's kind of the first step in engaging your suppliers and how to start those relationships and the communication. And now we'll move on to how to handle common challenges we've seen with suppliers. So we'll talk about first what to do when suppliers don't respond. Then we'll discuss what to do when your suppliers are SMEs and they're also producers, how to deal with incomplete or inconsistent data, and finally, language and technology barriers. So non-responsiveness of suppliers is seemingly quite a common issue where people are running into either non-responsive or kind of very delayed responses, not reacting to the urgency of the deadlines we're kind of feeling within the EU. So having kind of a standardized response here, a 3-step cycle, the reminder, a phone call, and then escalation to someone else within the business can be helpful. So you kind of have this standardized flow. I think emphasizing the regulatory obligation here is very important. Give it a sense of urgency of why you need this data, but also give them the support to provide you with the data. So, gather this sense of urgency, but also give your support to help them through it. And clear deadlines, explaining what you need and by when is very helpful to kind of make it more logical and clear in their minds. And finally, kind of, again, explaining that any missing data blocks their own trade into the EU. Once the legislation is implemented in December and then the penalties implemented in June, you fundamentally cannot do business with suppliers who are not providing you such data. And the next one is when you're working with SMEs and producers. So very often the people who are actually producing the EUDR relevant commodities on the farms are smallholders. They might be family farms or just a couple of people working on a plot. Often you might face a language barrier, a lack of consistent mobile service, and a lack of understanding or inability to kind of read documents and emails. So what we see here is often smallholders are relying on cooperatives. So an aggregator is collecting data for smallholders who will then act as that in between to pass on that data to you. And this is really kind of helpful to be aware of, and when you can kind of have your communications with the aggregator rather than trying to reach the smallholder themselves. But if you are working either with an aggregator or a smallholder, keeping requests simple and translated. With the rise of AI, Google Translate, this is kind of an easier task for us to do here. Determining the language and just translating those documents to make it that one step easier. And again, organizing this on the ground support is so helpful for suppliers to kind of kick them off. Canal Chocolate, again, simplified requests by asking only essentials in very clear language and then offering calls to help with any technical requirements. So once you've started gathering the data, we might often see suppliers starting to engage with the process. They're sending you some parts of the data, but not everything. Often we've seen kind of suppliers send certification data, so that might be FSC data, and expecting that that will be compliant with everything EUDR requires. But clearly that's not the case. And how to deal with this, the best solution we've seen is reviewing the data exactly and very thoroughly and determining exactly what's missing. So maybe marking with a highlighter or a red dot exactly where the data is missing, and then asking suppliers only to resend that specific data rather than doing the whole thing again. This can also happen on a call. So maybe you run through a call and you say, great, thanks for this data, but we are still missing these few specific files, and sending those named files. And comparing supplier data against past shipment to spot any errors. So again, the responsibility falls on you as the EU customer, EU importer, to have accurate and reliable data. So performing some kind of internal checks to make sure that the data they're sending is consistent with what you expect is also useful here. And finally, we're seeing language and tech barriers be a little bit of an issue. As I mentioned earlier, people on the ground often maybe don't speak great English or can't read the complex documents that are required. So one option here, I think Jasper mentioned previously, is self-declaring on your supplier's behalf. So this means you are responsible for collecting their information and declaring their geolocation, but also their legality requirements and documents for them. You have to make sure when you're doing this that you can still gather that correct information. So you need to engage with the suppliers to gather the information, but you can be the one putting this into documents and uploading when necessary. Offering translated or paper and electronic templates, again, is really helpful. And accepting photos and scans rather than requiring a PDF or a JPEG format is also helpful here, kind of allowing for a bit more leniency in the format you accept data in. So Canal Chocolate used translated templates and switches to translated WhatsApp messages or short bilingual calls to avoid any misunderstandings. So making it as easy as possible for those on the ground to engage with you. And if they don't have access to internet, doing things over the phone or through an aggregator is really helpful here. And next we'll talk about geolocation requirements. So one of the main requirements of EUDR is to have a geo-marcated plot of where the goods are produced. So now we're going to run through how to gather this data, what it looks like, how accurate it must be, how to engage smallholders in collecting geolocation data, and finally the common file formats we can expect to see. So for those of you who've read the EUDR legislation or engaged with some of the amendment documents or something, you will have seen maybe a polygon be mentioned versus a single point. And there's a little bit of confusion of where you can use which one. But essentially, when you're demarcating the plot of origin, so where the goods were produced, you have an option to either use a single point or a polygon. And the point is just a latitude and longitude numbers, and this can be used only for plots under 4 hectares. So yeah, it can't be used for larger plots, but if the plot is a smaller one, under 4 hectares, you can mark it just by a singular point. You have to ensure here that a 6 decimal points from 5 to 10, actually decimal points of 10, kind of identifying to a centimeter version of accuracy, which is not.
1 second. We had a microphone issue.
No.
Should be good.
Sorry, I had a little microphone issue. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, so as I said, latitude and longitude can be up to 6 decimal points, or must be up to 6 decimal points. Any more detailed is not necessary. And if you're trading in cattle, the establishments where cattle are born, stored, fed, grazed, etc., can always be demarcated by points, regardless of the plot size. So this is the exception to the rule. And then otherwise, for plots greater than 4 hectares, or optionally for those that are smaller, you can use you must use a polygon, and this describes the parameter of a plot. So we can see on the right here, kind of this polygon shape, which must align accurately to the borders of a plot. So Canal Chocolate, when explaining this, explains to suppliers the relevant approach to collecting geolocation depending on size of the plot. Yeah, as I mentioned, the accuracy requirements, that kind of 6 decimal place point for latitude and longitude. But on the other end of the spectrum, there is no maximum size to a plot. That's a question we've been asked. So plots can capture, a huge, vast area if this is the precise area where a product was grown and they have homogeneous conditions. So there can't be kind of other land types in the middle of this plot. The plot must be homogeneous. And to this point, you can't capture multiple plots with excess land in between. So, if there's a farm building or kind of a lake or something in between 2 plots, even if those plots are kind of growing the same thing, you've got to capture those in separate polygons. I'll delve into this a bit more in the next slide. And finally, if you have multiple harvests from the same plot throughout the year, you can use the same plot, but be sure to kind of register this on many harvest dates. So here we have an example of capturing plots. So question 1, plot B and C are used to produce cocoa. Can I draw around plot A to cover both in one polygon? So we can see on the image on the right here, B and C are at separate sides, but for this example, the farmer owns all land in A. It seems, the assumption could be that you could just cover the whole area of A, but in fact, you actually, as I just mentioned, have to demarcate the polygons very accurately and precisely. So if B and C are the only areas used to produce the cocoa, you must demarcate these precisely, not doing an excess polygon. And the next question, I only buy cocoa from plot B, yet plot C has been flagged as deforested. Are my goods legal? Yes. So if you're only buying cocoa from plot B and you've kind of registered this polygon in your data, your goods remain legal because you're not gathering anything from plot C. However, we'd recommend here kind of doing some more legality checks and delving into the reasoning. If a farmer is letting deforestation happen on plot C, it's highly likely that some rules are also being broken on plot B, even if it's not deforestation exactly. So yeah, gather those wider legality checks if that is the case. Working with smallholders. So communicating plot and geolocation collection can be quite confusing to smallholders. Again, like if they don't have very good mobile data service or haven't worked with GIS before. And I think here again, the importance is making it really simple and clear and really kind of holding a hand all the way through this. So starting with points rather than polygons, if applicable, depending on plot size, can be helpful here. We can see on the right, I dropped a pin on Google Maps in the top right corner of this polygon. And this one, for example, is smaller than 4 hectares, so that can be a good start. And in the future, this can kind of lead to building a polygon shape around the exact field. And just remember, it remains your responsibility as an operator to verify this information. So if you're sent geolocation coordinates, it's worth always checking in Google Maps yourself or another platform if the data they've sent aligns to the country and the region you expect it to be in and the size. And yeah, Canal Chocolate here sent their suppliers instructions on how to drop a pin and began by gathering single latitude and longitude data for the relevant farmers. And finally, the file formats that are acceptable. So you can gather this information in many ways. As we spoke about, you could even have written coordinates, which you then upload. But a GeoJSON file is the most common and the most easy to share. You can also use a shapefile, a KML, or a CSV file with latitude and longitude. I'm sharing here an example in the right, a picture of an app called GPS Congo. And this is an app that Canal Chocolate shared with their suppliers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, along with instructions. So really supporting the suppliers in collecting this data. So something you can do practically is, Google apps supporting geolocation, data collection in X country of origin, whatever's relevant to your suppliers, and then sending them a link to this app. So, making the barrier to entry very low and helping them collect this data. Great. We have another poll here. We just sped through a couple of common questions, but how ready is your organization to collect origin data? Are you already using a clear process and software? Have you started but still doing it quite manually? Do you know what to do but you've not started yet, or you're not sure where to begin, or maybe you're not reporting yet? We'll see these votes coming through. We can see that about 50% of you have started but are still doing quite a manual process. Maybe a quarter know what to do, but they haven't started. 20% of you are not reporting, and just a few of you are using a clear process and software. A point I forgot to mention here is that very often people might decide to use a software, and then if you do, for example, CoolSet, we have kind of an inbuilt polygon drawing platform, so you can kind of do that whole process within the app and share the CoolSet platform with suppliers, so you don't have to move data from maps to then a platform and then to traces, but it's all kind of contained within one platform. So that can be another option. And finally, I'm going to run you through a quick checklist of what we've discussed today before I pass on to Jasper, who will head up the 5 steps to success and the Q&A. So again, this can be useful, to bring some clarity into this quite confusing process, but beginning with mapping, so identifying all your suppliers, what data you need from each, depending if they're within the EU or outside the EU, and where in the supply chain they are can also be helpful, telling them, whether they have to collect them data themselves or if they have to get that further up the supply chain. Then you begin to prepare, so building a clear request pack with templates, examples, and an easy upload route, explaining to suppliers why EUDR matters and the impact of missing data, and then engaging those suppliers using email, WhatsApp, or calls to keep the process moving. And finally, review incoming data fast and follow up to close any gaps. So continue to review data and be kind of very responsive on requesting more when you see any gaps in the data. Great. And next week, we're going to do part 3 of the Winter School, which will focus on conducting risk assessments and taking action here. So we'll talk you through how to apply a supply chain risk, assess the supply chain risk, and decide when mitigation is needed. We'll follow a structured risk assessment process, use trusted data sources to evaluate the risk, and document and act on non-compliance issues. I'll pass over to Jasper, who will run you through the 5 steps to success.
Thanks, Freddie. So I'll very quickly go over this try to keep it within 1 minute. So for Coolset, we provide full supply chain traceability from farm to customer, which includes kind of the importing of all the relevant data points that you need. We do compliant risk assessments every step of the way, so you get instant deforestation and legality scoring, fully localized with governments and NGO. So we see an example here on the right of what that looks like. As soon as you click Run Assessment, you'll get basically the whole thing going. We mitigate fast when risks arise. So if you want to put a product on the EU market, you need to do the risk assessment, and then it needs to be non-negligible. If it is it needs to be negligible. So if it is non-negligible, then you need to do mitigation, which is also something that we support on the Coolset platform. And you can auto-generate and post DDSs to EU Traces. So we already have built the connection. The connection itself isn't live yet because EU Traces isn't live from a producer perspective. But we will get that going as soon as it's there. And for you, that just means once your sales orders have been connected to all the risk assessments, you can click on Generate DDS and it'll appear in the Coolset platform. And you can stay audit ready and prevent trading halts because we keep everything for 5 years. We can pull audit trails from the platform, and you can invite auditors into the platform as well. What we always offer is kind of a very practical session with our team to take you through some more practical questions that you have. I've seen a lot of questions coming in, so I think that's also really useful for some of you. Let me put that question live quickly. Give me 1 second. So perhaps some of you are interested in a kind of a one-on-one session, but for now, I'll just put the question here, let you decide if that's useful for now or not. If it's not useful, you know where to reach us either way. I see the answers coming in. So a couple of you are saying it is useful. Most of you find that it is okay for now. Understandable as well, but you know where to find us. Okay, then I also try to rush to this last bit because I want to leave more time for questions. I have been keeping my eye on the Q&A bar in the meantime, and I've been a bit overwhelmed by all the questions we've seen coming in. The questions a bit and look at the kind of the upvotes that we've been getting on the questions. For example, I'm looking at one question here that has 8 upvotes, so I'll start with that. If you do see any questions that you think are really relevant as well, feel free to upvote so we can make sure to prioritize it during this session. And then we'll try to kind of answer most questions over email after this session, so you still get your answer there. I'll put the first question live here. Question from Saskia. With 8 upvotes, if the new proposal is accepted, including the rebalance due diligence, what happens if the upstream operator does not do due diligence? Does this mean that the downstream operator would then be required to do due diligence despite the ascertaining due diligence requirement falling away? No, essentially, this doesn't mean that you have to do due diligence. So what we're seeing here is that companies, it's up to the upstream operator to do the DDS, and actually their product can't even get to you if they haven't done it because the product isn't allowed to be placed in the market in the first place. So under the regulations, and if it's audited and required, then you can be the one to kind of flag that. And there's also kind of a role within EUDR for people to kind of flag things externally. So you can then go to the authorities and say, hey, I'm trying to work with this company that's supposed to send me a DDS, but they haven't done it. That's the kind of the responsibilities, black and white. So I hope that answers it. Here a question with 4 upvotes from Claire. Will the possibility of a deferment for 1 year may also be voted on next week, or would this only be voted on in the December session if this is suggested as an amendment to the 21st of October proposal? What are the possibilities for this? Good question. So I think this is something that we can expect next week. Perhaps it won't be solidified yet, but we're now hearing kind of the accounts of the European Union kind of form a position. We know that the different parties in the European Parliament are forming very vocal positions. So next week, we'll definitely hear all the positions landing on the table. And I think we'll also then kind of know the sentiment or the final conclusion of the Parliament on where they want to go with this. So maybe we won't have the final answer, but we'll definitely have a very strong indication of where it will go by the end of next week. Moving up through the jungle of questions that we have. Let me see. I have one question from Xenia. I think this is a good question for Freddie. So who/which department should be responsible for the EUDR process? is this for example, communication data and data collection from downstream operator, purchase or sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it, of course, very much depends on your business structure and your size. But if you're a downstream operator, the main responsibility, as I'm sure you're kind of referring to now, is that traceability responsibility. So it's ensuring that you have that DDS statement along with your purchases. So it's likely that this responsibility would then fall with purchase or procurement rather than sustainability, because it's more connected to operations and purchasing and the movement of goods and data, rather than kind of more of a data collection and holistic requirements that are there for more upstream operators, or other ones.
Perfect. So let's see, we have some more questions. I know for those that know our webinars, the Q&A always runs a bit over time, but I think that's fine. Of course, for those that need to jump out, feel free to do so. But I think we'll just answer 2 or 3 more questions that we find quite relevant for today's session. Here, a question with 9 upvotes, so very relevant. If we, as an operator, purchase raw coffee with this HS code before the 30th of December 2025, do we need to submit a DDS on the roasted coffee if we sell to a trader or downstream operator in 2026? So from raw coffee to roasted coffee, and what are the responsibilities in the DDS?
Thanks, Jasper. As I can see, I believe, the HS code is changing, and you're required to submit a due diligence statement if you're the first placer of a product on the EU market. So as I can see here, you will be then in 2026 the first placer of the roasted coffee on the market. So yes, you would have to submit a due diligence statement. And due diligence statements are required at the moment of placing on the market. So it doesn't matter when you purchase the coffee, because you're manufacturing that into something new and placing it on the market, you will have to submit a DDS.
Perfect. So we'll take 2 more questions. So I'm just quickly reviewing which ones will be most relevant. I see here a question from Carolina with 3 upvotes. Another question: will you cover how to do the actual assessment of deforestation? So once we have the geolocation information, how can we make sure that the plot of land has not been subjected to deforestation? I'm going to give this a go and then pass it on to Freddie, maybe to expand on this a bit more as well. So essentially, when you provide all the geolocation information, what we do in the Coolsa platform, but what essentially any platform should be doing, is to use satellite imaging to see if deforestation has occurred in the period relevant to the product that you're sourcing. So you provide the geolocation data, the platform looks at the map, looks at the deforestation overlay, and then tells you yes or no, this has or has not been deforested. Any additions?
Yeah, that's exactly how it works if you're using a platform. For those who are not using a software at the moment, it gets a bit more complex because satellite data is quite, hard to access just on the internet. But there are sites, I think, Global Forest Watch, or maybe there's an EU satellite site as well, which can be used for this. You can also ask your producers surveys about deforestation and whether they themselves have felled any trees, but that's unlikely to be reliable. So satellite is the recommended way for this, and I think we'll go through that next week with the risk assessments on how to assess deforestation risk.
Yeah, exactly. So next week we'll definitely provide some more concrete examples there as well. One last question from Daniel with 5 upvotes. Do you have any updates regarding Switzerland's progress towards complying with EUDR? I haven't seen any recent information on this. I would appreciate any insights you might have. So indeed, EUDR doesn't directly apply to Switzerland, but I think if you do export to EU countries, you have very similar responsibilities. You do need to comply de facto with all the EUDR responsibilities. So you need to make sure that you do the plots, that you do the origins, you do the risk assessments together with your the company purchasing within the EU. I'll look into this a bit more to see if there's kind of any special ruling on whether Switzerland has to apply with EUDR as it is a member of the EEA. But I'll double check this, and if I find anything, I'll definitely get back to you and let you know. I think that's all the questions for today. I see that we have quite some that we haven't answered, which I think, yeah, it's nice to see that so many of you are engaged and asking questions. We will, after today's session, get through all of these questions and answer you over email. For now, thanks everyone for attending and for your time, and we hope that you found it useful. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you next week for the risk assessment session. Bye, everyone.